Welcome to this video in which I'll explore the new Blazor Render Modes available in .NET 8. I want to start building a new application using Blazor, but before I begin, I need to know something about the new render modes. In .NET 7, there was basically a choice of either server rendered or client rendered. With .NET 8, all that changes. Now, individual pages or even subcomponents can be static server-side rendered, server interactive, WebAssembly interactive, or interactive auto-render. Although it shouldn't be completely disregarded, static server-side rendering is exactly what it says, static. This means there can be no interaction with the user. However, static server-side does not exclude getting data from a database or an API on initialization. It just means it cannot be refreshed or updated by clicking a button on the page, for example. If no interaction is needed, it could be a good choice. To confuse the situation a little, Blazor now has a new option called stream rendering. This is an enhancement for static server-side rendering that allows something to be displayed on the screen, for example a loading message, whilst data is read from a database or API call, but it is not interactive. Server interactive is the equivalent of the previous server mode and uses SignalR and WebSockets to transfer data back and forth between the web browser and the server. WebAssembly interactive is analogous to the old WebAssembly mode. The page is rendered on the client and data is transferred between the client and the server via an API client service on the client and an API controller on the server. The work is done mainly on the client. For WebAssembly interactive mode, there is now a new possibility, interactive auto-render mode. In this mode, server rendering is used the first time the page or component is opened, whilst the WebAssembly runtime is being downloaded to the client in the background. Once downloaded, the rendering will switch from server to WebAssembly. The big difference is that now we can mix and match these approaches with individual pages or even subcomponents using any of the above rendering modes. Visual Studio 2022 now has 4 different Blazor web app templates, but which one to choose. To compare these various modes, I'm going to create sample applications using Visual Studio 2022 and selecting the Blazor web app template and then choosing the render mode. Let's have a look at how this is done. Open Visual Studio 2022 and click Create New Project. I've got my filter set to Blazor. Blazor web app is the one we want, so select that and click Next. Give it a name and click Next. Select .NET 8. I think that's the only choice I've got at the moment. Leave authentication type as none. Tick Configure for HTTPS. And here, this is the bit that's important, interactive render mode. There we've got a choice of none, server, WebAssembly, or auto. I'm going to choose each in turn, creating 4 different projects. Then we've got interactivity location. The choice there is per page or global. I'm going to select global to start with, reasoning that that's going to be simpler. Also make sure include sample pages is ticked and then click create. As I say, I'm going to be creating 4 and we'll come back to those by looking at screenshots rather than taking you through the individual apps. I have now created the 4 applications from the template, which I have inspiringly called Blazor Interactive None, Blazor Interactive Server, Blazor Interactive WebAssembly, and Blazor Interactive Auto. To compare and contrast the results of these templates, we're going to be looking at 4 areas: Solution Explorer, Program.cs, App.razor, and Weather.razor. These are where the differences will lie. And we'll start off by looking at Solution Explorer. So in Solution Explorer for the Blazor Interactive None project, we'll see that we've got just one project, and under the Components folder, we've got a Layouts folder and a Pages folder. And in the Pages folder, we've got Error, Home, and Weather. For those familiar with the .NET 7 templates, you'll notice that the counter page is missing. This is because there is no point in including it, as it relies on the interaction of the user clicking the Click Me button. If we now look at the Solution Explorer for Interactive Server, we'll see that this is the same. We've just got one project, Components folder with a Layout and Pages folder, but we've now got a counter razor in the Pages. Moving on to the Blazor Interactive WebAssembly, we've now got 2 projects, the main project and a secondary one with the same name but with .client on the end. The pages that we're going to be using, the counter, the home, and the weather, on the client or in the client project. And we also notice we've got 2 program.cs files, one in the main project and one in the client project. And lastly, if we look at the auto, for this, we've got exactly the same folder structure and file structure as we had for the interactive WebAssembly. Moving on to the program.cs file, for interactive none, we've got simply builder services with .add razor components, and we've also got here app, map razor components, and then just type app. That's for interactive none. For interactive server, we'll see there are 2 differences. We've now got add interactive server components under the builder section up here, and we've got add interactive server render mode under the map Blazor components. That's for interactive server. For interactive WebAssembly, we've got, in place of add interactive server, we've now got add interactive WebAssembly components, and in the map razor components we've got add interactive WebAssembly render mode, but also add additional assemblies. And the type of Blazor Interactivity WebAssembly, that's just the name of the project or the application. So that could be anything. It could be my Blazor app. And lastly, if we look at Interactive Auto, we've now got both in under the Builder Services section, add interactive server components and add interactive WebAssembly components. And under the map razor components, we've got both add interactive server render mode and add interactive WebAssembly render mode. So I think we can see there's some kind of logic here, that for server we add the server components, for WebAssembly we add the WebAssembly components, and for auto we add both. We'll now look at app.razor, and this is for interactive none, and we'll just remember that head outlet has nothing and roots has nothing. For interactive server, we'll see head outlet has got at render mode equals interactive server, and roots or routes has at render mode interactive server. If I move on to WebAssembly, we've got interactive WebAssembly in place of interactive server. And if I go on to interactive auto, we've got interactive auto here. Again, fairly logical. We'll come back to this, but this, we've got to remember, is when I've set up the global. And what happens, as we'll see later, that AppRazor takes precedence over the individual Razor pages. So what we've got here dictates the render mode for the individual Razor pages. For weather.razor, we've got interactive none, and this is where the template adds the attribute stream rendering. So this will allow this loading message to be shown whilst waiting for the data. For server, WebAssembly and auto, there is no render mode here. That is dictated by app.razor. Having set up these applications from the templates, I decided to run them. So let's have a look at one of them, because I thought there was a problem. I've selected my interactive server application, but I found the same problem with interactive server, interactive WebAssembly, and interactive auto. So if I run this, I'll attempt to show you what the problem is. And it's on the weather page. So if we go to the weather page, we get the loading message and then we get the data, which is as we would expect. If I go back to home, go back to weather again, we see the same thing. But if I select to refresh the page, if you look very carefully at this top row, it's very fleeting, but you should be able to just catch it, that this data swiftly changes before we get another loading message and some new data. So I'm going to click refresh. And very briefly, I think I saw 49 there. If I do it again, I think I saw 13 there. So what is the problem? By placing a breakpoint on uninitialized async, I discovered the uninitialized async was visited twice. And another way of simulating that is to put a console write line here. So let me just add that. And if we run it again, I'll bring up the console. Click on weather and look at the console, and we've got one uninitialized async. If I choose to refresh it, we've now got 3. We've added another 2. And if I do it again, we'll end up with 5 here. So the problem is that it's visiting the uninitialized async twice. And after a lot of investigation, I discovered there was an issue logged on github/asp.NET Core, and I'll put the reference to that in the description. And it appears that this is by design, because pre-rendering is turned on by default. I did quite a bit of investigation here and then discovered that to get around this problem, you can turn pre-rendering off. And most of the solutions I found said that we had to put an attribute up here or a directive. And the one I found was this. So it says at render mode, new interactive server render mode, and we're turning pre-rendering off. So I ran it again. And go to weather. We get the loading, and we can see here we've got one uninitialized async message. If I refresh it, I think I saw 19 there. And looking at the console, we've now got 3 uninitialized async. So that is not the solution. And it took a bit of digging, but I realized in the end that that's not the place to do it. App.razor is the one that controls everything. And in app.razor, we haven't got the render mode pre-rendering turned off. And the way to change that is I'll just comment out these two lines and replace them with these. And now we're saying the render mode is interactive server render mode, but pre-render is set to false. So if we run it now, click on weather, we get the loading, and we've got one uninitialized async. If I refresh it, we go straight to loading, and we don't get this double take here. And on the console right line, we've only got 2 for each visit we've made. So what have I learned from that? It is that when setting interactivity location to global, app.razor takes precedence. What we put in here counts, and putting things on individual pages doesn't count. So if we truly want to use this new facility or ability to mix and match, we've got to set the template when we create it to location, interactivity location needs to be set to per page stroke component. So what would be the effect of changing the interactivity location from global to per page stroke component when creating an application from the templates? To find out, I created 3 applications with the following: interactive server components, interactive WebAssembly components, and interactive auto render mode. I didn't consider it worth creating an application with an interactivity none. And this is what I found. If we look at Solution Explorer first, I called my projects Blazor Interactive Server per page, WebAssembly per page, and Auto per page, but that's just my naming for them, so I could keep track of what I was doing. On the server, as one would expect, the pages are all together under the Pages folder. For the interactive WebAssembly and Auto, the file structure and folder structure were the same, but what we have here is the home and weather pages are on the server, on the main project, and only the counter is in the client folder project. And if we compare that with the global, where we had the all pages were in the client project. So that's a minor difference, but one worth noting. If we look at the program CS for the server project, for the interactive server, we've got the add interactive server components and the add interactive server render mode, as we did for the global. For WebAssembly, again, we've got the same as we had for global. And on auto, again, we've got the same as we had for global. So those haven't changed. So program CS doesn't change. What does change is the app.razor, which for server, WebAssembly, and auto has nothing. Previously, we had something under the head outlet and under the roots. Nothing there now. So bearing in mind that the app razor is the kind of top of the hierarchy, and previously when we had it set to global, everything we set here carried down to subsidiary pages, we haven't got that here. So if we look at the weather razor, for example, on the server, the WebAssembly, and the auto, we've got this attribute stream rendering. Previously, that was only on the server. If we now move down to look at the counter page, where we've got interactive server, we've got interactive server as the render mode. Previously, we had nothing on the counter page. On WebAssembly, we've now got interactive WebAssembly, and no prizes for guessing that for auto, we've now got render mode equals interactive auto. So those seem to be the principal changes associated with the location or interactive location being changed to per page per component. So what have I learnt so far? In simple terms, when using the templates, setting interactive location to global sets the interactivity for the application in app.razor and, it seems, cannot be overridden at the page/component level. Alternatively, setting interactive location to per page/component does what it says and allows interactivity to be set to server, WebAssembly or auto on individual pages. But I am left with a question, and I'd like to carry out an experiment. The template for interactive WebAssembly, with interactive location set to per page per component, creates the weather page in the main server folder. What would happen if I created a similar weather page in the .client project and set its render mode to be interactive WebAssembly? Firstly, would it display the double visit on initialized async, and could I prevent it? Let's have a look. This is my Blazor interactive WebAssembly per page, and to save you the pain of watching me do it, I have basically copied the weather page from the pages on the main project to the pages on the client project, and I've renamed it Weather on Client. And the only major difference is that instead of having the attribute of stream rendering on the main one, I've now got render mode equals interactive WebAssembly. I've also added this new page to the nav menu. So let's run it and see what happens. Here's the application running. If I go to Weather on Client, we get that strange flicker where it loads data first and then shows the loading. I'm a little perplexed as to why that's happening, but I'm going to gloss over that for the moment, and we'll go back to the code, and instead of having render mode as interactive WebAssembly, I'm going to change it to prevent the pre-rendering. So I'll comment out that line and add this. Right. I'm not confident, but we shouldn't get the double visit now. Okay, weather on client. It's not fast, but I don't think we got two lots of data. Let me refresh it. No, we don't get the double visit. I now want to go one step further. I want to see if I can change the render mode to auto and what would then happen. So let's close this and go back to the code. The first thing we need to do is to make some changes to program.cs, where we need to add in the interactive server components here. And the add interactive server render mode down here. And on the weather, I want to change that from WebAssembly to auto. And now we run the application again. Click on Weather on Client. It shows the loading message, and then we get the data. If I refresh, get the loading, I saw it briefly, and then we get the data. And one last change, just to satisfy my curiosity, is whether we can change this to interactive server render mode, even though this is actually in the client project. So I'm just going to try that. And run the application. Weather on client. And it loads. Refresh it. And it loads. Well, that seems to work. Now, before we leave, there's one more problem. While researching these various render modes, I came across a very concerning problem highlighted by someone called Carl Franklin. Basically, when navigating between pages, auto mode does not switch from interactive server to interactive WASM. It also appears that state is lost, and with it cascading parameters can get set to null. I'll put a link in a YouTube video where Carl Franklin discusses this together with a complicated workaround. It's been reported on GitHub/ASP.NET Core, and the response from Microsoft appears to say that nothing is likely to be done about this in the short term. So, what are my conclusions? My conclusions are these. Firstly, despite the fact that it has taken me nearly half an hour to reach this point, Blazor render modes aren't as scary as I first thought. Secondly, global means global. If you select global for interactivity location, the application render mode is effectively set in app.razor. Conversely, if you want to use the new flexibility to set the render mode at the page component level, interactivity must be set at that level. Thirdly, all options have their pros and cons, but for maximum flexibility, I'm tempted to use the interactive auto option with interactivity location set to per page/component, even though I doubt I will actually use auto on individual pages. I also suspect that the problems encountered by Carl Franklin are unlikely to affect the applications I'm likely to create. Similarly, if one is worried about the double visit to the uninitialized methods for some pages, I don't think that's as big a problem as maybe I've made out, but in any case, you can set pre-render to false. Fourthly, for simple applications, I could also be very tempted to use interactive server and global, just to keep things as simple as possible. I'll follow this with some information about resources I've found useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this has proved to be a helpful video. Thank you.